It's really important to ensure that your team has communication that makes them feel included, involved, and safe. So the worst is when there's an incident and a management team just decides to say nothing about it. And then you have a bunch of employees just wondering, like, wait, the office is closed. Why did they close? Is it safe to come back to work? Is it not? And then there's a lot of rumor, and often the rumor is worse than what actually happened.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. In the U.S., employers have a responsibility under the Occupational Safety and Health Act's General Duty Clause to provide a workplace, quote, free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Certainly, this means workplaces that are designed to minimize risk of injury because of poor design, failure to maintain equipment, or poor training. But another key part of this responsibility is protecting employees from physical threats presented by other people, whether outside actors or even our own employees. Larger employers may have security departments tasked with protecting the company and employees from physical risks, but many organizations don't have a security or even a safety department. And often they don't recognize the need for physical safety and security plans until they're facing a threat or, worse yet, something has already gone wrong. Joining me today to discuss workplace violence prevention and other forms of physical security is Anna Redmond. Anna is the founder of Braav, a Los Angeles-based private security firm providing workplace violence prevention planning, chief security officer services, security assessments, and technologies to manage and improve organizational security. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Anna.
Thanks, Mike. I'm so happy to be here.
So I want to get into Braav and physical security concerns and workplace violence prevention. But let's, and I definitely want to get into workplace violence because that's what so much of our audience thinks about when they first think about, physical security. But what other physical security challenges do employers face besides workplace violence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's so high on the list and it's so often in the news that it's the first thing that comes up. But the truth is that a good security department really takes care of a lot more than that. Often, if there are security guards on the premises, they're the first ones that may respond to things like, oh my gosh, like a pipe burst and there's water all over the place. Who do we call? They're the ones that figure out things like access control. How do we know who gets into the building and how do we protect the people that are inside? They should be on point for figuring out if there's a special event, what precautions need to be taken in addition to what normally happens. And so it's a lot more than just this boogeyman vision of someone coming in with a weapon. It's all of the different ways that you secure a workplace.
So, I spent my career in HR. I'm also, I have a private security license here in Texas because, we're an investigations firm. When I'm not doing HR consulting, the other half of our business is background investigations, and we have to have a PI license for that. So I'm in that space. I don't know many people who came into that space directly. I mean, like I was an HR guy who ran background checks for a large healthcare system and then kind of stumbled into this as I had a consulting practice. How did you get into physical security?
That's such a great question. And when most people meet me in person, they kind of do a double take and they're like, you don't look like you were a Navy SEAL or
I'm not typecasting here or anything.
No. And I generally say that is actually absolutely correct. There's this notion in like startups, if you're a non-technical founder, which means that you don't have a technology background, I like to apply the same version of that to security where I'm a non-security founder. Up until 4 years ago, I knew very little about physical security. And I actually had a personal experience that made me really pay attention to the space and want to build a company in it. Pre this, I had built a totally different startup, building content creation platforms for Fortune 500s. And one day I had dropped my kids off at a class, walked across the street, excited to get a cup of coffee and peace at the local Starbucks. And for the viewer and the listener context, I live in Los Angeles, which is definitely a city that has struggled with safety over the last couple of years. And sitting in this Starbucks in front of a huge picture window, I saw a man walk out the Starbucks and get into this massive altercation with a sort of tall, scraggly looking, unhoused guy who had just walked by. And it looked like something out of a movie. They were bumping up against the window. Like this was a real fight. And at one point, drops of blood splattered on the window. And my jaw fell open. I didn't know what to do. I was stupefied. And at the end of a couple of minutes, the Starbucks barista, who was a like very young guy, probably in his like early 20s, went out and successfully broke up the fight. And then the next thing he did is he pulled out a spray bottle and a rag and started to clean the blood
Oh,
off of the
wow.
window. And in all of this time, my brain was on overload. And I went home that day, picked up my kids, and was like, oh my gosh. And it made me start asking all these questions from the perspective of, the Starbucks customer, me, but also from the employee side, like what just happened? What were the right steps in this situation? What was the security protocol for Starbucks? Should we have expected the police to respond sooner? And I'll be honest, I couldn't shake all of those thoughts. And as someone who is an entrepreneur, sort of it's in my fiber, I did a ton of research and I probably spent about 2 years understanding what exists in the physical security space. How do you get strong physical security resources? What are the needs both on the customer and on the business side? And all of that led to us launching Braav, with the vision of really making physical security easy to understand and easy to implement for mid-sized businesses that may not have a full-time head of security and who need additional resources. Much like, honestly, like I needed that day, like I think that Starbucks needed that day to have someone come in and say, like, what's the protocol? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? What could we have done to make things safer? So, it's been an exciting journey. I've learned a ton. I am truly in love with this industry. And it's a weird thing to say, but I have met people who have really impressed me, and they've really impressed me with their drive and desire to be of service to other people. And to be honest, given what we see in the news, that's not necessarily what I expected to find. And so it's been refreshing and inspiring.
I've got friends in the executive protection part of the business. I have friends in the guard space. We've had my friend Jeff McKissick on before. He was back in episode, like one of our first 24 episodes, easily, about workplace violence training and those kind of things. And I've seen so many of our clients security plans and their policies around just the Starbucks kind of situation. And I'm hearing ding, 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 all these little red flags go off. An employee intervening in a physical altercation outside of the location, and then cleaning it up. There's a biohazard issue here, and he's cleaning up blood. I mean, that's all these things. I'm like, yeah, this is, and you would think, and well, you hear about it in retail too, right? People,
Yeah.
all these big, grab and goes where people just go in and grab a whole rack of clothes and carry them out of the store and just challenge the locals to, the what do you call it, the retail employees to chase them down, and they won't. They're trained not to, and they're not supposed to lay hands on people or physically chase them down, but they do on occasion. All those policies, and that maybe just in the moment you've got those policies, but you're not thinking about them because you went through that training 6 months ago, and now you've got the adrenaline of an issue right now.
Mhm. Or maybe you never went through the training, right? Or
Yeah,
maybe it was online and you clicked a bunch of boxes and
click,
it
click,
didn't
click.
really
Yeah.
stick, right?
So when you're going into a client, and I assume the first thing, if they just say, hey, we need to spice up our security, we just know we don't, we've had these little incidents and we need an assessment. What does that look like? If a company's going to, go through the process of doing an assessment of their security, what kind of things do they typically look for?
Yeah, so in those cases, we send in one of our fractional heads of security, and the folks that we bring on, by the way, to tell you a little bit about their background. The people that fill this role for us have to have had strong leadership experience on both the public and private side. So these are folks who are like former chiefs of police, special agents in charge, regional directors of public safety, and then transitioned into private security and led there. So they've seen everything and they have a really good sense of what the landscape looks like. And then, depending on the size of the company and how big of a physical footprint it has, they would want to understand what the property looks like, what kind of area it's in, right? So, what are the concerns that are external as opposed to coming from within the building? They'd want to understand what policies currently exist and review those policies. Often we find organizations either have no policy at all or honestly, an HR person who has no security background wrote it. And so they missed a bunch of things, which is totally fair, right? Because that's not what they had training in.
Yeah, they probably Googled it and found a template on the internet and ran with that. Yeah.
Exactly. And we like to do a survey of the employees that will respond to it to understand what their concerns are and what's happened. And we find that that's a really clean way to get a sense for what the concerns are. And sometimes there are things that employees are worried about based on what they see on the news. So we do have a lot of situations where we go in and they're like, we'd like to do an active shooter training or some active shooter education, not because they're particularly high risk for it, but because people stress about it. And there's, as you know, there's tons of research that being well prepared is the key thing that helps people respond correctly in situations. But sometimes you find other things like employees will note like, hey, the front desk person's supposed to check IDs and they never do. Or there's a back door that people come in through that's supposed to be locked, but it's open. Or sometimes they'll identify things that are happening internally, like I've had managers yell at me and make me feel berated and bullied and targeted. And then that's stuff that we want to escalate as well, because depending on what state you're in, and in fact, in most states, first of all, those are things that can end up in a lawsuit, right? And second of all, those are things that are actually on the pathway to violence, and you have to be aware of what they are so that you as an HR person can keep an eye on them, right? Like, was this someone yelling because they had a bad day and it's a one-off thing, or is this a person that's been escalating over time? In which case, it should be something that's on your radar. So that's the universe that they would start with. And then, of course, as they walk through the building, they look at everything, including safety tools. So are the defibrillators blocked by heavy furniture? Are there fire extinguishers that are where they're supposed to be that are not expired? Is there a first aid kit at the desk of the reception? A lot of folks we've gone into maybe have had a panic button installed 10 years ago, but no one knows how to use it. No one knows if it works. It hasn't been tested. And they don't know if they press it, who comes? Is it the police? Is it a private security company? Have they continued to pay that private security company that's on the other end of that panic button? So there are a bunch of loose threads that are sort of hanging out. And it's really important to have someone come in and pressure test those at least once a year.
And then that assessment comes back. And let's say we have some policies and they're not very good. And there's a lot of gaps there. And, an organization with 25, 50 employees, 75 employees on site, they're going to want to prioritize, they're going to do the cost benefit analysis basically and say, what's the biggest bang for our buck? What do you typically find the 2 or 3 most important things most organizations don't do that they really ought to do that would make a big difference?
We counsel our clients to think of it as insurance, right? Like, you want to be doing it and you want to hope that it's never useful, but it's valuable for 2 reasons, right? It helps prevent actual incidents. And there's a ton of research that if there is an incident, companies that are up to speed and have done their work, their costs are way lower. I think it was something like 500 on average, 500K on average, if there's any kind of incident and the company did not have good policies in place versus under 100K. So the numbers really support having done the prep work in terms of bang for your buck. But additionally, I think it's really important to understand if there's like a groundswell of unhappiness that the company is not aware of. And so, to that extent, if we survey and there's a small core group of people that's really unhappy about something, you want to know that before it turns into an incident or a lawsuit, and you want to have a chance to address it. Sometimes it's really easy, like, hey guys, let's keep the door locked, or reminding the front desk admin, like, you really need to be checking IDs. In terms of policy changes, I think the thing that I have seen most commonly is when policies are good on paper, but they're not fully extended to the whole organization. So, an example of that, um, you know, 10% of workplace violence incidents come from domestic incidents. So that means, one of your employees had some sort of conflict with a current or past ex, or like with an ex or with a current spouse or partner. And then that person shows up at the workplace, maybe just by themselves and angry, but gosh, sometimes with a knife or a gun, right? And that's really scary. And that's a meaningfully significant portion. What we have seen a lot of is where, let's say, someone files a restraining order against an ex. You absolutely need to tell your HR department, and most companies are good about that. But if they bring vendors on site or partners on site, they don't extend that questioning. And not too long ago, one of my CSOs dealt with that with one of his clients, where a vendor's employee had an ex-boyfriend who was very upset and showed up on site and was not on any sort of lists. And the receptionist just let him sail through. And he had a knife, and no one, thankfully, was seriously injured, but it was a really scary incident. So it's an example of, having some of the right policies in place, but not making sure that they're ironclad and extend to the whole organization.
Well, yeah, and along that lines, we see it all the time with companies that do very good background screening. Very thorough background checks on their employees, anybody interacting with customers or on site, except IT goes and hires an outside contracting firm to do some work, and they've got their people on contract coming in and out, and nobody even knows who they are. There's no due diligence. And often your vendors will say, "Yeah, we do that. We do background checks, but it's not to your standard. There's not that same standard of care as we called it when I was in healthcare." And then something goes wrong, and that employer, for letting that person on, that company that let this person on site, is going to be in the hot water, just like the vendor is for letting somebody who does something, whether it's violence or it's just theft of intellectual property or anything else. That's a really good point to that, posing your security guidelines, making sure everybody understands them, even when they're vendors or third parties who are coming on site. So since we're talking about workplace violence, there's those internal threats of somebody that employee whose life circumstances have changed, or something's gone wrong, their chemistry's gone wrong, whatever, and suddenly they react in a physical way against coworkers. And then there are the external threats, like the ex partner or the current partner who's become unhinged and poses a threat to that employee and to the whole group. I know California, where you're based, probably has one of the leading workplace violence laws now in the country as far as employers' responsibilities. What does it cover, and how are you seeing employers respond to it?
So we recently in California passed Senate Bill 553. And it's pretty extensive. We've actually helped a lot of our clients implement it, and it requires that any employer with more than 10 employees, and there are a couple of carve outs, for instance, if they're all remote, then it doesn't count. But anyone with more than 10 employees needs to go and implement exhaustive training, reporting, and follow-up policies so that employees are able to report workplace violence, have confidence that whoever they're reporting it to is going to investigate it, record it properly, and keep it in a way that OSHA can come and audit it, and then take the appropriate steps as a result, whether that means maybe changing the policies or updating them or taking other steps to keep everyone safe. And it feels like a lot. We've worked with a lot of clients that looked at the law and were like, oh my gosh, this is an enormous amount of work, but also I don't know how to do it. And probably the most common thing that we're called in to help with is, okay, we've created a policy. Maybe we had someone help with it. Maybe we just kind of did it ourselves. Okay, we've created forms for reporting. And maybe we've also put a box by the front desk if someone wants to slip an anonymous report in. But once the reports come in, what the heck do we do with the reports? And the challenge is that sometimes reports aren't very clear cut, right? Like it's very obvious if someone reports and says, James brought a gun to the office. And in our policy, we clearly have a no weapons policy. But often it's much more subtle than that, right? It's like, I was watching these people argue, and I think someone may have been pushed, but I'm not sure. And the person on the receiving end of the report really needs to understand what the best practice is in terms of forming a plan to respond to that. And then if you decide no response is necessary, you need to have a follow-up plan because you can't just let it go. You need to check in and make sure, hey, I thought it was okay. Is it still okay in a month? Is it still okay in 3 months? And when do you get to table that and kind of put it in the archive bin, but still keep it in case something surfaces? So there's a lot of nuance there. And we've come in, and as part of the training, actually, we do a lot of discussion around what the pathway to violence is, what to keep an eye out for, what sorts of things are reportable, and then how to de-escalate situations. And we found that all of the groups that we've done that presentation to, the employees are really engaged. And they're like, some trainings you sort of sleep through. This was really interesting, and it applied to areas of my life outside of the workplace, right? Like we could all do better at learning how to de-escalate tricky situations.
You mentioned that pathway to violence, those things to look out for. What are some of those things that y'all have noticed are particularly high yield? I mean, when we see, this, what are the symptoms that, this is a real red flag that we need to respond to?
So the typical pathway, they have you look at changes in behavior. And it's the change that's really the operative word, because sometimes people are temperamental. Like maybe someone just, their whole life has gotten really annoyed by little things like spilling your coffee or bumping an elbow or something coming in late. That you can look at and be like, well, I don't really have a gut feeling that something's wrong. That's the way that Stuart or Jane has always been. But the pathway is really about noticing, is something changing and is something getting worse? So did someone who used to show up on time, are they suddenly coming in very late? Do they suddenly smell like alcohol? Are they suddenly becoming way more curt with others? Have they started talking about violence in a way that feels off or threatening or alarming? We'll often have conversations around weapons, right? Because this is the US, you're in Texas and people own guns and they're allowed to own guns, right? But there's a difference between saying, oh, that's interesting. There's a new gun manufacturer. Now they let you, make these adjustments to your weapon and personalize it. And they're having a sale tomorrow. And that's interesting versus, I could take out 20 employees with my gun, right? Like that's a scary and extreme version of it, but that's an example of what to listen for. And obviously that scales back. So, I think it's valuable having that conversation with people. And I think the other piece that's so valuable is depending on what sort of environment you were trained in, your age, your background, the part of the country. Some people may think, well, I can only report it if it's physical. I can only report it if it's really clear. I feel really dumb reporting something that turns out to be nothing. And it's useful having the conversation of, look, if you have a niggling feeling that something is off, why don't you let someone investigate? And if they investigate and they decide that it's nothing, that's fine. That's good faith reporting where you're trying to keep people safe. And that's much better than 2 weeks from then. And this happens with so many workplace shooter incidents where people are like, I had my doubts about him, or I was really worried about him for a while. And the other end of that spectrum is it's not always a workplace shooter, right? Like there are a lot of employers dealing with suicides, which is really scary and really sad. And sometimes that gets caught in this reporting too. It's like, hey, can you step in and help and reach out to someone and connect them to an employee assistance program? So I think that's the value of these sorts of conversations.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. 25 years ago, I founded Imperative to help risk-averse clients make well-informed decisions about the people they involve in their business. Because we don't cut corners, our research is more thorough, and our reporting is more robust, our clients make better hiring decisions. However, employers often don't even know what to ask beyond price when evaluating a background screening partner. So, we've compiled a short list of 6 questions that you should ask any prospective screening partner, including Imperative, to ensure that you understand what they're really trying to sell you. These questions identify the most common ways background check companies cut corners that impact the quality, accuracy, and depth of the information they provide employers. You can review the 6 questions you should ask of your background check partner at imperativeinfo.com/6. And of course, you can always reach out to Imperative to discuss your background check process through our website at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 177 and enter the keyword Redmond. That's REDMOND. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Anna Redmond. And then there's the external threat. So we kind of touched on that, but those partners, other folks that maybe there's a restraining order against them, things like that. And we work with agencies that place nannies and domestic staff and high wealth, ultra high net worth families, things like that. And, the level of their background checks is often better than, most of my corporate clients because they're dealing with family, kids, things like that. And we even check for restraining orders against that person, or that person has filed actively against other people. Because if my nanny has a restraining order, has somebody against a spouse or a husband or ex or whatever, I want to know before I send this person out with my children in public.
Absolutely.
But when it comes into when you're in a more business, more corporate area, and somebody says I've got a restraining order, sometimes those restraining orders are just pro forma. They come with the divorce proceedings, and they're kind of a generic stay away order or whatever. Then there's the real restraining order where somebody really has real fear for their safety. When somebody brings that to HR or to their supervisor, what ought the conversation look like from the point of view of the company?
In general, the most important thing to understand is give us a sense for what happened, what your concerns are, and anything that this person has said specifically. So, and also, I think it's important to understand who the person is, right? So, if your restraining order is against someone who's, a judo champion, that's probably it's helpful to know that, as opposed to if it's just against someone with no special skill set and you had a bunch of conflicts. I think it's also useful to know if it's a parenting conflict and maybe you're bringing your kids to work sometimes. Is it a conflict where this person has tried to take your kids and maybe they're restricted from your kids? And the other thing I think you'd want to understand as a company is just how long has this been going on? Is it changing at all? Is it becoming better or worse? Sometimes these things escalate around specific proceedings, like while you're getting a divorce, and then they settle down. And then I think it's also important to ask, look, what can we as a company, what can we do to support you? Because sometimes the answer can be surprising and sometimes it can be simple, right? It can be hey, I really would like to leave work at 4:00 instead of 5, because that way I can leave this area before my ex leaves it. Or it can be, can I work from home for a couple of weeks? Or it can be, gosh, it would be really nice to have someone walk me to my car in the parking garage, or maybe I'd like to change my parking spot and park right by the elevator. So without asking, you don't know, there may be adjustments that you can make. But I think just as a basic thing, workplaces should have access control and they should know exactly who comes onto the workplace. And there should be someone keeping an eye on it. And there should be a path that's very clear to everyone around what happens if someone tries to get in who's not allowed. And is it you're calling the police? I mean, really, depending on the way that they're trying to get in, you should call the police right away. But is there a backup? Is there a private security company involved? What defense tools are you choosing to keep on site? Some companies choose to keep pepper spray. Some of them keep whistles. Some of them have the panic button. So it's just understanding what the plan is and making sure that it's a reasonable plan.
And so many organizations, you can walk into the lobby, demand to see somebody. I mean, I was just at my CPAs last week, and you just walk into this nice building. Nobody checks who you are. You walk up to the receptionist, who is certainly, typically not somebody who's going to be able to physically stop somebody from pushing past them or doing something. And, without access controls or without, any, physical barriers to accessing the rest of the work team, those folks are at best, a psychological barrier, a slight, but I've always thought that layout of a reception area is one of the highest risk things that companies do. And I understand why you do. You want it to be relaxed and welcoming, but from a physical security standpoint, it seems to lower the barriers to that kind of somebody coming on site with a bad intent.
It can be for sure. And the other thing that we hear about, which is interesting, is it may not look like physical violence. It may be sort of something that sits on the cusp of physical and cyber. And an example of that is like someone who's nicely dressed and comes into your reception area and is like, I'm handing out free USB sticks. Can I leave these here?
Oh, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
There have been so many hacks that have started like that. Or, they're really innocent, nice looking guy in a suit who's sitting in your lobby working on his computer for a couple hours. Guess what? He's inside the firewall because he's physically in your space. And so one of the conversations we have is like, how can we alert everyone if the front desk receptionist is actually part of a security organization as opposed to a front desk receptionist? How can they be trained to be aware of all of this stuff and look out for it? And that's important too. So I think at the end of the day, your mileage varies depending on the person that you put at the front desk, how you train them, and then what that actual access control looks like. There are buildings where you have to swipe to get into the elevators, right? And the person at the front desk actually has the key card. And so they have to be, really dramatically overpowered in a significant and highly visible way for someone to take that away from them. And then it's a whole other level of incident, and you're calling the police and getting public help with that. So I think, you're totally right. And we've seen people do it so sloppily, and then we've seen it done very well. And I hope that as time goes on, we move a bunch of clients towards that part where they're doing it better and better.
And we're almost out of time, but I want to wrap up with, okay, so let's say we've had an incident and we need to do some sort of, it's worked out however it has, but we need to do some communication to our team. We need to just have some, crisis management, communications out there. What are your high point, bullet points about handling those kind of conversations and that communication?
That's a great question. And we do a lot of crisis management training. And one of our CSOs actually is a nationally recognized expert in that and travels and helps both police departments and civilian organizations with it. And you're right, it's really critical because it's not just what happens during, it's what happens after. So a couple of the high points, you always need to use any crisis to inform a revision of policy. And that doesn't have to happen the next day, but it should happen very soon after, because you need to be able to show that you've learned from it. And if there were gaps, that you're working to close those gaps. It's really important to ensure that your team has communication that makes them feel included, involved, and safe. So the worst is when there's an incident and a management team just decides to say nothing about it. And then you have a bunch of employees just wondering, like, wait, the office is closed. Why did they close? Is it safe to come back to work? Is it not? And then there's a lot of rumor, and often the rumor is worse than what actually happened. And people feel nervous and anxious. And that can actually spin off into completely different incidents. So it's really good to have a resource who can tell you the best practices for how much information to share. It doesn't mean always sharing the names of the people involved, because that can be under investigation, that can be a violation of privacy, but at least letting people know, like, hey, XYZ happened. This is what we're doing to keep you even safer afterwards. These are the steps we're taking. And then the other part of damage control after incidents is also understanding how you need to follow up on it. So let's say it was from someone who came onto the property who's an estranged ex. I think it's important to know, like, are they, did they end up with a prison sentence? How long is the duration? Are they still a threat? If they're continuing to be a threat, what steps are going to be taken? If they're currently detained, but you don't know for how long, someone needs to be on that, and they need to be following up, like, hey, are they still detained? Are they no longer detained? What's the pathway there? And you need to be taking steps to keep employees safe. And probably if it's a big enough incident, it's helpful to go and do some retraining afterwards, particularly if it was something where there may have been earlier warning signs that weren't quite caught, or maybe that were caught but weren't quite reported. And then there's a way to do that that's no blame, that's not like, hey, we're saying someone did something wrong, but really coming in to just refresh everyone's memories and making sure that the organization comes back even stronger and even safer.
Well, that's a perfect place to end it. Thanks for joining me today, Anna.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Marianne Hernandez, Imperative's marketing coordinator, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.